We have a wonderful panel ahead of us, which is going to answer some burning questions about what is the relationship between libertarianism and Catholicism. If you want to know, sit down. And even if you don't, please sit down. Good morning. My name is Cathleen Kaveny, and I am delighted to be a member of the faculty of both the law school and the theology department here at Boston College. And I'm delighted as well to be the moderator for this panel, which I think is going to build on the tour de force in the Professor Ryan's keynote address this morning, which articulated both what is clear about libertarianism, but more importantly, what's not clear about it. And one of the things that's not clear about it is its relationship to Catholicism. So that's what we're going to be looking at in some of the panels today. And the first panel is going to be looking at questions of social libertarianism and Catholicism. What does Catholicism have to say to social libertarianism? And just to frame what we're talking about, although with a great caveat that it may apply, what I'm about to say may apply to liberalism as well as libertarianism, we have to discuss that. I think that there are three basic anthropological principles or commitments or insights that libertarianism may own that Catholicism may say not so fast to. And I'll say that they are describable in these terms. First, I think a libertarian approach has an atomistic account of the human person. Each human person is an isolated, separated individual with a wall around it, almost like a property wall, as Professor Ryan suggested, is a good image. Second, a libertarian approach is constructivist in the way it thinks about what we do as human persons. We make ourselves the self-made man, self-made woman too. We define our own conceptions of the good. We pursue those conceptions of the good. One way of thinking about a libertarian social ethic is the famous mystery passage from Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where you have the right to define your sense of meaning yourself and even of the universe. Even the universe. And the third piece of social libertarianism, I think that's important, that Catholic thought may have something to say to, is that it's aggregationist. Libertarians see people get together to form community. You're separate, and then you form a community by reason or by way of a contract. You're not organically already part of a community. So I think Catholic thought has something to say critically to each of these three components, and I'm expecting our panel of experts here to help us do just that. Our first speaker will be Professor Mary Jo Iozzio, who is an expert in moral theology. She teaches at the School of Theology and Ministry here. And she's going to focus on the limits of libertarianism, however we define it, when looked at through the lens of the lives of persons with disabilities. Those are a substantial component of our communities. We are all at one point, if we live long enough, going to be persons with disabilities. So it's an important thing to look at. Professor Dillon, who teaches moral theology at Providence College, Dominican school, we're very ecumenical here, we've got the Jesuits and the Dominicans, is going to broaden from the core insights that Professor Iozzio gives us and look at Catholic thought in general on questions of vulnerability, on social nature, on community, and on how we ought to think about those matters on key issues of social debate, ranging from abortion to euthanasia to same-sex marriage. She'll give us a framework for thinking about that. And then finally, we've got Professor Mark Silk, who is going to give us an insider-outsider perspective. Anybody who's read Professor Silk's writing knows that he knows more about the Catholic Church than most Catholics. At the same time, he is not a member of the Catholic community, but belongs to the Jewish community. And in a pluralistic society, getting an insider-outsider perspective on the role of one religious tradition's contribution to the broader project we have in common is essential. So each of the three speakers will have the podium for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation both among them and between the panelists and the audience. So first up, Professor Iozzio. Let's set you up.
Good morning, thank you. So I've titled my remarks, Libertarianism and the Rights of People with Disabilities to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. This year, many in the United States and our legislature are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This legislation, modeled after the Civil Rights Act that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and Section 505 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, that forbids excluding or denying individuals with disabilities equal access to participate and have access to programs, benefits, and services, both prohibits discrimination against and guarantees equal opportunity to people with disabilities. To be protected by the ADA, a person must have a disability which is defined as, and I quote from the ADA, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. It's a very, very broad definition. Since 2000, nearly 220 communities throughout the United States have signed agreements with the Department of Justice under Project Civic Access to ensure that their citizens with disabilities enjoy the same services, programs, and activities that all others enjoy. These agreements oblige communities to follow the uniform federal accessibility guidelines to meet architectural, procedural, and communication standards. Moreover, no qualified person with a disability may be excluded from participating in or denied the benefits of the program, services, and activities by state and local governments and other public and private enterprises on account of disability. These measures have raised awareness of the presence of people with disabilities in the United States and beyond, and have raised consciousness of the often scandalous ways that they have been treated historically from ancient times and continuing to the present. Some of the reasons for this scandal rest in what is called the social construction of disability, a model for understanding the history from recognition of the power of norms to divide people into an us and a them. As much as the social construction offers an attitudinal position as an obligatory stance toward the other as other. Other reasons for scandal betray a failure to admit human interdependence on the multiple degrees and levels of relationships that each human being requires in order to become, to develop, and to flourish until the end of our days. That coheres very nicely with the original position, one might say, of libertarianism, I put it down here, to flourish to the extent possible given one's potential by means of the bounty that God has provided to us. All right, thank you, Alan. That has as its origin, not that comment, but the notion of relationality from a Catholic perspective, has its origin in what we might say about the Trinity. As Christians, we believe God is triune, and the only way we can know who God is as Christians is through this revelation that comes not until the incarnation of Jesus, and then the resurrection, which we've happily celebrated and continue this week. This is the week of Sundays. We shouldn't be working today. Anyway, so if human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, and God is a Trinitarian reality, then by definition, we are relational, in relationship, and those relationships are what I would charge John Locke with, one of the framers, it would appear, of the libertarian philosophy. I would charge Locke's notion of the natural state is not as absolute individualism, but rather a community. This law is certain, the ADA law is certain. Discrimination in matters of employment, programs, and services on the basis of disability is no longer tolerable. Fair enough. People with disabilities and their advocates now ask about access so as to enjoy the benefits of such guarantees. Many others, libertarians among them, ask who will bear the cost. This question provokes adherents of libertarianism and raises their suspicions about government interference in a free market and in the exercise of personal autonomy to disperse my wealth, for example, as I deem right. So again, what Professor Ryan had mentioned to us about, it's not so much autonomy as it is about private property. One of the tenets of libertarianism is to maximize autonomy by protecting individual judgment and freedom of choice. In and of itself, this tenet meets little resistance among most to the extent that one person's exercise of autonomy does not impinge on another person's exercise of autonomy. This libertarian tenet and others protect individuals from the imposition of another's and/or of a government's will upon their own. Not surprisingly, libertarianism has influenced a good deal of America's understanding of itself, of the American way of life, of manifest destiny, Westward Ho, and Herbert Hoover's rugged individualism. A libertarian insistence on autonomy is apparent in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form so as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. End quote. Thomas Jefferson was well-versed in libertarian thought, even as he was committed to the common good, that governments are charged to protect and serve, and that within reasonable limits, governments can expect its citizens to support those programs that protect and serve. I wonder if Jefferson would recognize the direction that the initiatives to break from British tyranny have since taken. For example, we now know that the Declaration was written in and with white, free, able-bodied men of the colonies in mind. An unarguably non-libertarian position to hold today. Women and black folk would wait 144 years and 189 years, respectively, for enfranchisement and the rights and freedoms protected by the Constitution, subsequent amendments, and the laws found in the Federal Code of Regulations. Libertarians assume that these laws have leveled sufficiently the field for social progress among women and people of color. However, barriers reinforced by the social constructions of sex, gender, and race, as well as institutionalized disadvantages, prevents their development and advance in the contemporary human economy. Where libertarians fail to recognize the persistence of disadvantages for women and people of color, they fail also to recognize the profoundly disadvantaged access to the conditions that support the development and skills belonging to people with disabilities. Their basic human functioning capabilities to be, to learn, and become proficient, and to thrive. Each of these groups has been denied an exercise of their autonomy, something that should raise the concern of libertarians. Moreover, this failure relates to a certain American hubris that holds each and every one of us has the wherewithal and support required for success in life. the Lockean state of nature. If only you would just try harder, pull up your bootstraps, get to work. I understand the desire and need to protect autonomy. However, given the historical realities with which people with disabilities as a class have experienced, they have been denied development of their capacities, unique to individuals of every class, everyone in this room. To maximize the exercise of their autonomy, they have been held back. Like women and people of color, people with disabilities are disadvantaged on account of institutionalized systemic injustice that denied and continue to deny them access to the means of acquiring the skills that would hone their potentials. To address this denial properly requires a return to the question of justice for and with people with disabilities. Reluctant though many will be to admit it, individuals in a libertarian state, however free and self-reliant they may appear, are nonetheless dependent on social conditions that are meant to account for many of their incapacities. This is a quote I've taken from an author, Carlos Ball, writing for the UCL Law Review in 1999-2000. The title of his article is Autonomy, Justice, and Disability. These conditions, right, the social conditions that account for incapacities, these conditions include things like housing, education, healthcare, reliable protections from harm, social infrastructure, all part and parcel of the common good, which supports the development of those basic human functioning capabilities whereby human beings thrive despite the presence of this or that, or these or those incapacities. This dependence must then be reckoned with whose responsibility it is to bear and to what extent the provision of goods and services beyond the reach of most, if not all, members of the human community are met. Who will then bear this cost but, in the words of libertarians, a civilized society? And to what extent but the proportionate need that individuals will have from less to more on account of their transient and/or permanent incapacities? Aquinas, for example, defines the distributive justice as opposed to other forms of justice that he writes about. Distributive justice is based on a proportion of needs, not of an equal arithmetic distribution, but how much you need is what it need, really, as opposed to desire. How much you need is what the state, what the community, what the church must work to provide. I'm using the lingo of the libertarians to challenge their vocal protest of the ADA. They really don't like this legislation. That protest focuses on government intrusion of private holdings, inclusive of income garnered and business conducted. Disability access beyond national, state, and local governments should be left to the goodwill and free choice of the owner. All right, there's the cooperation, there's the charity piece. Thus perpetuating the tyranny of the normal. Private schools would not be required to provide interpreters and/or wheelchair access. Those students could learn elsewhere, or more than likely nowhere. New or renovating restaurants and shops would not have to admit blind, deaf, and/or wheelchair users. Those customers are not welcome. Businesses could refuse to hire people with disabilities, thereby perpetuating the cycle of poverty that plagues most people with disabilities, even those with the competencies to do the work for which they applied. The problem with leaving this support to goodwill or charity leaves people with disabilities, their families, and their caregivers without security. Moreover, leaving this support to charity misses the critically important work of dismantling the systems that deny support to people with disabilities as a matter of routine operations under the assumption of a purported inability to contribute to the social capital of the common good. Most perceptions among normate people, the non-disabled people, many of us in this room at the moment, but surely that status will change if we live long enough. These things said, following Augustine, on this point, charity is no substitute for justice withheld. Thank you.
I'm very glad to be here and be a part of this conversation. I will say, although I teach with the Dominicans, my uncle's a Jesuit, so it's okay. So my task today is to consider the difference between the way that Catholic social thought tends to approach some of these key non-economic social issues, economics later, right? I'll try to stay away from it. And the way that libertarians tend to approach the same issues. And I was trying to figure this out a little bit, and I realized these name sets of tendencies, but it's not as though there's one clear party line on either side, but I'll do what I can with this. I also want to just say up front that as I was thinking about these things, I believe that Catholic social thought gives us a lot of tools to push our political discourse deeper than it goes. But a lot of times we go to the libertarian defaults. And part of my interest is trying to push us beyond that. Professor Ryan said earlier that he thought that he wasn't sure whether libertarianism was Catholic, but he thinks it actually might be liberalism, or a form of liberalism. And I'll say that my investment is exactly to say that Catholic social thought is not libertarianism, and that's important, and we need to pay attention to some key differences. And so Kathy already set up some of these a little bit, but I really want to pay attention to a couple of key differences in Catholic social thought's approach to these issues from that of libertarianism. And really there are three basic areas with some overlap. So first is that nature of the person as fundamentally social rather than atomistic or individualized. Second, and related to that, is the fundamental nature of freedom. In fact, Professor Ryan already alluded to this in terms of it's one thing to have our rights discourse and these kinds of things, but if we don't have a concept of what the good is or what we're aiming for, our discourse falls a little short. And I think Catholic social thought has a vision of that. And the final thing that I'll weave into this a little bit, I will be talking about some issues as I go along, is the fundamental purpose of the state. Whether that has a relationship to the common good or something much more minimalistic like protecting a public order. And in fact, because Professor Ryan mentioned it and made such a big deal about it, I want to make a brief little Catholic comment on this. So one of the things that's very interesting to me about libertarianism is that property rights seems to be a natural right. Whereas the claims that community makes on us those are not natural, right? So those are added, those are voluntaristic. So in other words, we end up having a government that has a claim, an obligation to protect us against the claims of our fellow community members while protecting our property from such claims. So I want to pay attention to those things as we go forward. So in terms of the fundamental nature of the person as being social rather than individualistic or atomistic, I want to think about this a little bit, and I want to think about it in relationship specifically to the issue of abortion. So when libertarians make arguments for, we get the language of a woman's right to choose. Right, we have this sense of, as has already been alluded to, that there's a sense of the ability to define one's own life, one's own limits, the sovereignty over one's own body, and we get the mantra of every woman has a right to choose. Right, that's familiar language to all of us. Every woman has a right to choose. But in order to display the fundamental difference that I think the intrinsically social nature of the person makes, I want to offer you an alternative version of that line to think about. So I said, every woman has a right to choose. Let me ask you to hear it this way. Every mother has a right to choose. Jarring? It's not what we're used to. And I think that language indicates one fundamental little shift. When we say, or we suggest the possibility of the claim that every mother has a right to choose, then we imply that there is already a relation, already claims that the unborn child is making. So just to explore this a little bit further, Every woman has the right to choose implies that a woman is making a choice in isolation, that she stands alone, no claims upon her other than her own desires, goals, or purposes as she wants to define them in that particular situation. Or to press the issue a little bit further, to play with this language, she is only a mother if and after she chooses to be one. Both the personhood of her child and the relational identity between the two of them depend on and are subsequent to the woman's choice. But if we say, in my alternative phrasing, every mother has a choice, we expose the relationship that always already exists with all of its implied claims. We cannot say every mother has a choice where the choice implied is abortion, because we know that the word mother names a relationship and implies a set of responsibilities, claims, and obligations. When we hear the word mother, we generally assume someone who has an investment in the care, protection, and promotion of the flourishing of the other. In other words, when we use a word like mother, we name a deep and intrinsic connection fundamental to the identity of both persons, and that names the interconnectedness of their goods. The relation is not dependent on the choice of either, but flows from the bond that is intrinsic to their relationship and to their natural existence. And so, as you can see, this clearly is an argument against abortion. But I also want to help you see that it displays the radical difference of what we mean when we talk about the intrinsically social nature of the person in Catholic social thought. That we are always already in communion, we are always already connected to one another in a way that we have interconnected sets of claims on one another, and in fact, our goods are mutually constructive of one another. That is, as the Catholic social tradition has an idea of the common good of all and the good of each, that are mutually constitutive of one another. Our own political discourse always assumes that our goods are in conflict with one another. The good of all and the good of each can't possibly coexist, but Catholic social thought really insists that those, in fact, do mutually constitute one another. And this sense of a common good, this sense of an intrinsically social nature of the person, is true before we choose to be in relationship with one another, before we enter into any kind of voluntary social contract, before we choose to identify with this or that group, whether it's national or ethnic or religious or partisan or even familial. These bonds of interdependence are always already there, naturally and unchosen. I want to go just a bit further and say this is not simply, although I think this bond between a woman and her unborn child, a mother and her unborn child, certainly displays it. This bond is not simply familial, but in fact, the claim of Catholic social thought is that the human family all have a bond of interconnection and interdependence with one another. We all share a common good. And yet, when we think about the discourse that we have about abortion, do we hear about common good? Sometimes, rarely. We hear about competing rights claims. The right to choose versus the right to life. The right of the woman versus the rights of the child. Our discourse is so dominated by these competing rights claims that we never develop in our discourse a shared vision of the good that would allow us to adjudicate competing rights claims well. We pay attention to the atomistic rights claims of atomistic individuals whose rights come into conflict with one another, and we fail to develop the kinds of visions that would help us adjudicate those claims. I want to point to a couple of other issues, really just briefly, where you can see the same kinds of dynamics going on. One of my favorites is gun control, because it's fun to avoid the sexual loaded issues just occasionally. A little violence instead, that's all good. But and of course we have a lot of libertarian arguments for gun control, the right to bear arms. I had the 14-year-old son of a friend at Easter dinner yesterday arguing with me about how important it is that we have the right to bear arms and defend ourselves against the encroaching evil government. And these are important ideas, right? That individuals have a right to have the means to protect themselves. However, it's clear from the documentation of gun-based violence that the access that we as a population have to guns also endangers many of us much of the time. We would all say that we have a right to be safe, especially in our schools, right? In our workplaces, all these places that are often come into threat. But we also say that we have a right to choose to bear arms. Do we have a vision of the good sufficient to allow us to adjudicate these competing rights claims, or do we just talk past one another, rights versus rights? I think about the same things related to same-sex marriage and the desire to have conscience protections for everybody from bakers to photographers. We have a sense of a right to marriage that is developing, state by state, right? But we also have a sense of a right to appeal to conscience. Are we able to talk about the goods at stake? And I would name just a few. There is a real good in recognizing marriage in any form, to talk about stability and protection of families and society as a whole, to talk about equality, but also, as many people want to make sure we add, to talk about whether or not marriage has a natural connection to children and the possibilities of procreating that. We have this interesting reality around same-sex marriage in this country right now, where we are increasingly insisting on a public recognition of what were once private relationships without really getting into the debate about everything that marriage means. Well, there's some debate, but was it helpful? Was it helpful discourse that really moved us forward, or did we again talk past these things? So what I want to call us for today in all these matters of discourse is to pay attention to the ways in which, as Catholics, we have a sense, who are drawn and wanting to live by Catholic social thought, we have a sense of an intrinsically social nature to the person, an intrinsically social nature to the good, that is, our goods are in fact in common. And even while we want to protect and promote individual freedoms, it's crucial for us to do that in a way that also envisions the connection of what those freedoms are for. And what that involves then is a robust conversation about the common good and what it constitutes. And I just want to end on one keynote, because it's a question that I was asked earlier. I do think one of the important things to remember coming from Catholic social thought is the concept of subsidiarity. I think subsidiarity is our sort of Catholic version of that government is best that governs least. And yet it is not the same as that government is best that governs least. What subsidiarity does is it directs the larger order societies, so federal government, state government, down to the local level, to support the local visions and initiatives of the most local communities, and really the vital cell of society in the eyes of Catholic social thought is the family. That's the lowest level. So when we talk about the needs to respect the freedoms of individual persons and of families and of local communities, we actually have a means to talk about respecting those freedoms, but also always with a positive obligation to help and support those initiatives to work together for the common good.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Always wonderful to be at BC. I do want to thank Kathy for letting you in on the secret that I speak as an outsider. I'll tell those worthies looking somewhat balefully at me that assure them that some of my best friends are Catholics, including especially Mark. Our friendship goes back to graduate school. Brought together by a common seminar with our leader, Bill Hutchison, and a deep common interest in the late Father Leonard Feeney, who, for reasons some of you will know, is, even as I speak, turning over in his grave. Anyway, I do think it was pretty clever to put a Jew between a bunch of Catholics and lunch, so I'm going to read fast. So here goes. 30 years ago, when I was in the process of transforming, or should I say degenerating, from a medieval historian into a journalist, I undertook a freelance assignment from the Boston Globe to write a series of profiles of notable academics, one of whom was the late Robert Nozick, professor of philosophy at Harvard, a bit of a wild and crazy guy, and the most philosophically sophisticated libertarian in the country at that time. In preparation for this colloquium, I thought I'd exhume that profile, and if I do say so myself, it stands up pretty well. But one line jumped out at me as out of date, to wit, in matters of freedom, American culture provides for a certain division of labor whereby the conservatives uphold free markets and the liberals bear cudgels for free expression and liberated lifestyles. Nowadays, the liberals are no longer worrying so much about free expression, and while the conservatives are still upholding free markets, they have extended their libertarian outlook beyond economic behavior. For example, in his 1994 conservative polemic, Dead Right, David Frum takes after William Bennett for subtitling The Devaluing of America, his 1992 conservative polemic. The subtitle was The Struggle for Our Children and Our Culture. What, asks Frum, is the locution our children doing in Bennett's mouth? The phrase contains the thought that one's obligation to all other children in the country is similar in nature to one's obligations to one's own, that a purely political bond, that between citizens of one nation, can resemble in some meaningful way the biological bond between parent and child. Since then, Frum has drifted away from this kind of libertarianism, but his book marks, I think, a societal shift that has recently been spelled out by Robert Putnam in his new book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. Here's Putnam talking about the book a month ago with NPR's Scott Simon. He said, "When I was growing up in Port Clinton and my parents talked about doing things for our kids, when they said, you know, we've got to pay higher taxes so that our kids can have a swimming pool or a new French department or whatever, by the word our kids, they did not mean my sister and me. They meant all the kids in town. And what's happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years is that our sense of what counts as our kids has shriveled." Contra Dead Right, I would argue that the political obligation to the children in our community, nation, and world is similar to the biological tie between parent and child. And I think that view still prevails in the precincts of the Democratic Party, as perhaps evidenced by Hillary Clinton's use of the well-traveled proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child." But in that other party, not so much. Here is Fox News' Andrea Tantaros talking with Bill O'Reilly about an alleged downside to government programs to make children healthier. Saying, quote, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, Tantaros claims that these are, quote, causing mental problems, and that kids will develop eating disorders because of them. Oh, Andrea, come on, O'Reilly expostulates. 1 or 2 kids are going to have an eating disorder no matter what you do. It's the greater good that must be served. The greater good, explodes Tantaros, pointing at O'Reilly. There's the People's Republic of Massachusetts oozing out on the couch. Whoa. Glad to be here. I was born in Cambridge myself. Of course, Bennett and O'Reilly are Catholics of a certain generation who, for all their ideological conservatism, have retained the teaching of their church articulated last month by Pope Francis when he said, "A society can be judged by the way it treats its children." I presume that Tantaros, the daughter of Greek immigrants, is or was Greek Orthodox, but more importantly, she's a child of the Reagan era, 3 decades younger than Bennett and O'Reilly. The enthusiasm for Rand Paul, aforementioned at this conference, and before him his father, among the younger generation of conservatives, is plain for all to see, and it has infected even old conservative fogies like George Will. In a word, conservatives have moved toward a philosophy that is explicitly hostile to any public policy that smacks of concern for our children, ergo, pejoratively, the nanny state. I will consider that philosophy, libertarianism, to be what the contemporary libertarian thinker Tibor Machin defines as, quote, the view that the task of politics is liberty, nothing more or less, and the task of virtue, human excellence, or happiness is a task that only the individual on his own can strive to fulfill, either alone or in personal and voluntary association with others, never by force or coercion. There are, of course, alternative views of the task of politics, including not only human excellence and happiness, but also social welfare and justice and harmony. But for purposes of this colloquialism, I propose that we consider the libertarian view to be opposed to what Catholics tend to call the common good, a complex political undertaking that aims at a number of the above tasks and which therefore must find a balance among them. Forgive me if I neologistically called this view common goodism. It's important to recognize that while libertarianism and common goodism may each have a proclivity for certain public policies, they are not policies themselves, but rather ways of advancing, justifying, or rationalizing them. When Nozick says that government should not be in the business of preventing, quote, capitalist acts between consenting adults, he is making a libertarian argument for capitalism. When Joseph Schumpeter argues that capitalism advances morality, he is not making a libertarian argument for it. Our bodies, ourselves, is a libertarian argument for abortion. Protecting poor women from the hardships of unwanted pregnancies is not. Minimizing pain and suffering is not a libertarian argument for physician-assisted suicide. Claiming a right to terminate one's life whenever one wants to is. What makes a libertarian is, as Machin indicates, the privileging of liberty over all political ends, and a consistent libertarian will do this across all realms of political activity. But as my old profile of Bob Nozick suggested, across the board, libertarianism has not been the rule, at least in this country. Traditionally, we've had economic libertarians who embrace the Austrian School of Economics, Hayek perhaps excluded, civil libertarians who identify with the ACLU, and moral libertarians, sometimes known as libertines. The distinctively new development is what I propose calling spiritual libertarianism. This is a form of libertarianism that sets as its highest political task not free markets or free speech, or let us say, making the country safe for sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but the free exercise of religion. This new spiritual libertarianism has in the past decade established itself on the American right. The story of the valorization of religious freedom among conservatives is an interesting one, particularly since within pretty recent memories, liberals were the religious freedom stalwarts. For them, providing a means for religious minorities, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, the Amish, to gain exemptions from legal injunctions was an important dimension of civil liberty and part and parcel of the rights revolution in American jurisprudence. Under the circumstances then, it was no surprise that liberal justices were the ones on the Supreme Court who opposed Justice Scalia's decision in Employment Division versus Smith, which determined that neutral laws of general applicability could ipso facto not violate the free exercise clause, i.e., that you couldn't go to court to protect your free exercise rights against a law or regulation that applied neutrally to everybody. This decision led, of course, to the passage of the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was designed to make the court revert to its pre-Smith standard of strict scrutiny, requiring the government to demonstrate a compelling state interest in the law or regulation and to show that this interest was being advanced by the least restrictive means. The coalition that made RFRA happen was led by the Dean of Liberal Religious Lobbyists, David Saperstein of the Religion Action Center of Reform Judaism, now our ambassador for religious freedom. The bill, which passed Congress almost unanimously, was enthusiastically signed into law by President Clinton. 4 years later, the court swatted down this intrusion on its judicial prerogatives in Bernie versus Flores, but ever since it has sought to limit the reach of Smith without actually reversing it. Beware the wrath of Nino. Because my time is short, let me cut to the chase and say that in his Smith decision, Scalia quite intentionally threw free exercise into the political arena, saying to religious objectors, look, if you want an exemption from a neutral, generally applicable law, make your case in legislative bodies. Subjecting the constitutional right of free exercise to majoritarian decision-making seemed like a really bad idea to civil libertarians, but most conservatives had no problem with it. I figure because they didn't imagine that they'd ever lack the political clout to get the exceptions they wanted. They began to have problems when they stopped getting those exemptions. Suddenly, religious freedom was under assault as never before in American history. Spiritual libertarianism was on display this year in the run-up to passage of Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, so much so that it extended its reach beyond religion in a way analogous to conscientious objection during the war in Vietnam. Here, for example, is a, I'm afraid, somewhat extended excerpt from a blog post by conservative activist Monica Boyer featured on the Indiana Tea Party website in January. It's long, but it's worth hearing. The media has wrongly portrayed this bill to be only about gay marriage. This couldn't be further from the truth. This freedom of conscience bill was designed to protect those who want the freedom of conscience when it comes to healthcare decisions, as well as organizations such as religious charities, businesses who have convictions, colleges with faith statements for students and employees, and so much more. The Indiana RFRA is not only for those who are religious. As my friend Jesse Bohannon said, even an atheist has a right to refuse to do something that is morally repugnant. Hoosiers should not be required to provide a service, produce a product, rent out property, or be forced to do business with someone if the service goes against their conscience, religious or not. Contrary to the hype the media is spewing, this is not a theocratic bill, it is a freedom bill, freedom for everyone, not just some. It's worth noting that the Indiana Catholic Conference, which supported the bill, gave at least lip service to a more balanced philosophy. The bill, the conference said in a statement, establishes a legal standard that protects state interests as well as individuals and religious institutions. When there is a compelling state interest in the law or regulation, it must be done in the least restrictive manner, thus protecting both, thus the common good, while respecting the conscience and religious freedom of all affected. And after the national firestorm over the Indiana law broke out, the state's Catholic bishops said in a statement, "We urge all people of goodwill to mutual respect for one another so that the necessary dialogue and discernment can take place to ensure that no one in Indiana will face discrimination, either whether it is for their sexual orientation or for living their religious beliefs." I'm afraid, however, that spiritual libertarianism is alive and well in the American Catholic Church. This is, for the historically conscious, somewhat ironic, given how late the Church came to the modern world's religious freedom party. Indeed, in the early 1990s, the American Catholic bishops were latecomers to the RFRA coalition because they feared that in a hoped-for post-Roe v. Wade world, someone would try to use the act to assert a free exercise right to abortion. But in recent years, religious freedom has been promoted as the ne plus ultra of the American democracy. As the Bishops' Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty put it in 2012, it is, quote, "our most cherished freedom. It is the first freedom because if we are not free in our conscience and our practice of religion, all other freedoms are fragile." In practice, this spiritual libertarianism can be found in the Catholic lawsuits opposing the Affordable Care Act's contraception mandate, which manifest a singular unwillingness to acknowledge common good considerations on the other side. As my friend and organizer of this conference, co-organizer Michael Sean Winters wrote the other day, "Someone should tell the Little Sisters of the Poor that their conscience should not be troubled by filling out a form that exempts them from having to provide contraception coverage to their employees. Instead, we have bishops who suggest same-sex marriage is a civilizational threat, which it is not, and who encourage the Little Sisters to think that signing a form is material cooperation with evil." The Fortnight for Freedom, some people here may have celebrated it, has become the Church's annual festival of spiritual libertarianism. Why not, for example, a fortnight for immigration reform? To my way of thinking, the goal of balancing religious liberty and common good considerations has been on display most clearly in Utah's recent anti-discrimination legislation, which was not merely backed by, but negotiated with, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There, as in Indiana, the Catholic Church seems to have held back and may even be said to have supported the bill. At least that's how I read the following sentence reporting on it in the Intermountain Catholic, which is the Salt Lake diocesan newspaper. The bill represents many hours of work with leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and LGBT advocacy groups to create a state law that strikes a fair and just balance between providing for these basic needs and protecting the rights of people of faith to exercise their beliefs. By contrast, the Catholic Church actively opposed a comparable anti-discrimination bill in Wyoming, calling it, quote, "an unconstitutional infringement on a fundamental constitutional right." Last month, that bill failed. I'll just conclude by saying that libertarianism in its spiritual form is very much at war with common goodism in the Church today. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists for a wonderful, and enriching discussion, or start to our discussion. And what I'd like to do is ask you to comment on one question, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. We've been talking a lot, as Mark Silk just said, about different types of libertarianism. we've economic libertarianism, social libertarianism, now even spiritual libertarianism. And one of the tasks I think that we're trying to grapple with in this colloquium today is, what is the relationship among these? Do you buy them as a set, or do they come independently? And where, in my listening to the comments today, it seems almost philosophically they ought to come as a set. If you're a libertarian in one realm and prioritize freedom in one realm, you ought to prioritize it across the board. But in the practical arena, in our American politics, it seems as if we pick and choose. You know, some of us are economic libertarians, Republicans. Others are social libertarians, Democratic. And now we have spiritual libertarians, and we're not even quite sure what that is yet, although it is a piece of Catholic politics today. So what I'd like to ask each of you to address is, what do you think about the relationships between these types of libertarianism for the issues that you talked about? And how do you think the best part of the Catholic tradition should respond to what you see as the situation? And with Professor Silk, you are an honorary member of the Jesuit tribe today, which is very broad. So you can respond however you want, as an insider or as an outsider or as an outsider insider. So we'll start with Mary Jo.
Thanks.
De nada.
So I think generally libertarians don't like a set. I think they do pick and choose among them. That being said, the question that presents itself for the matter of people with disabilities and supporting access to all sorts of programs and services that contribute to their development, their full development as persons, requires all three of these in many ways. It's a large economic commitment that needs to be addressed. Who bears the cost of that? Certainly Catholicism has many different outreach programs. There's Catholic Charities here in the United States, as well as Catholic Relief Services, Caritas International. It goes across the board in terms of organized efforts to relieve the suffering that many people experience, not just those with disabilities, but particularly those in developing national contexts and or disasters. Socially, I think Catholicism is standing on dangerous ground, as I think they're standing on dangerous ground when it comes to something like a spiritual libertarianism. I think that Professor Ryan's comment, as he started his presentation, about what the vanguard of the Cato Institute, for example, looks like. These are very wealthy white men. It's a very small portion of the world's population that could count among wealthy, white, able-bodied, able-minded men. Most people in the world fall into a different class altogether. The easiest distinction is, so here's men and here's women, basically half of the population. Here's people of color, here's persons of descendant from Anglo and Northern European contexts. I think that these are challenges to libertarianism, and it's a disruption. It's a disruption to their unearned privilege and exercise of power when civil rights type legislation is put forward, particularly in matters of people with disabilities, whom the majority of folks will assume, wrongly, are incapable of doing just about anything for themselves. And nothing could be, in fact, further from the truth in terms of people with disabilities. The diversity of disability is not accounted for in any of the libertarian positions. Catholicism, again, is taking a cue from social teaching, the preferential option for the poor and marginalized. This is I think, a key entree for breaking the stalemate that a Catholic libertarianism has established, to think only of those people who have, by tradition, held the reins of power. Again, the clerical estate in the United States.
Great, thank you. Dana.
Wow. Okay, so I'm actually thinking, for some reason, not about an issue that I talked about exactly, but about the HHS mandate and contraception and how that played out. And I'm being told I need to get closer to the microphone, sorry. So one of the things, I think that there is a way in which our discourse, what do we have to do legally, what can we fight so that rights are protected legally, really shape us into a sort of minimalism. There's a way in which we all end up being libertarians despite a perhaps richer vision of the common good behind us. And the particular instance that I'm thinking about is in a lot of the conversations around Catholic institutions, and my own world is particularly Catholic institutions of higher education, around whether we should comply or be forced to comply or fight and do lawsuits and what have you against the HHS mandate. I found myself thinking, well, you know, I support our right to fight this and some conscience protections and what have you. But my goodness, I would feel so much better about Catholic institutions fighting that mandate if they were also on the absolute forefront of maternity leave, family leave policies, these kinds of things, right? Why can't we go, I mean, if we need to fight certain sort of minimalistic battles and fight for our rights and what have you, why can't we also embody the full richness of our teachings as well? And I mean, my suggestion is, like everybody else, we're always going to pay as little as we can, right? And maximize economic advantage in the ways. And so we become minimalists in the whole thing. And I think we do end up picking and choosing based on some sort of minimalistic economic and political goals that are right in front of us. And I call us to living that broader vision.
So no libertarianism in that sense, not picking and choosing. Mark?
I'll just say quickly, I think that Professor Ryan's suggestion that libertarians tend to see all rights as property rights, even if it's pretty analogically, you know, I have a right to my own mouth, I have a right to my own conscience. You know, I would go with that. I do think that that the, I would say, Christian tradition of sometimes honored in the breach, of really respecting individual rights of conscience goes pretty deep and is pretty libertarian. And I think the challenge in all of these things is how you balance interests. You don't let people exercise their religion by practicing their sincerely held commitment to eating other people as cannibals. And so I think what's been missing is, in a lot of the talk, and sometimes it's just lip service, it is a real willingness to think about competing needs.
Great, thank you. Well, we've heard from our very distinguished and insightful panelists. Now it's time to hear from you. Do we have any questions? Yes, Megan.
I want to thank you all for an interesting panel, and particularly thank Dana and Mary Jo. I was very nervous with two theologians up there that there was going to be an awful lot of overlap between what you both were going to say and I thought I might be spending lunch rewriting. So I'm very glad that I'm not. I want to pick up on something Dana and Mark kind of overlapped on, and ask everyone, including Kathy, maybe if they want to comment. I'm struck, and I really like this kind of talking about spiritual libertarianism and the ways in which it's manifesting itself within the American Catholic Church. I want to question, through the context of same-sex marriage, if that's not making us blind to where we actually are hearing people talk about a greater vision of the good. So my context in teaching, right, is millennials, and they get a bad, and I'm on the cusp of counting as a millennial, and they get a bad rap for being kind of self-involved and selfish, and as if it is about my rights versus your rights. But in my experience, the reason that there's been such a massive shift when you talk to them on same-sex marriage is that their understanding of the right is based in a vision of the good. A vision of the good for the person, as well as the good of marriage, as well as the good of equality. And that in certain ways, it's coming out of not perhaps a failure always of understanding the deeper understanding of the good of marriage in Catholicism, but actually appropriating that and understanding it very differently in the 21st century America. So I'd like to hear you comment on if perhaps our political rhetoric and this spiritual libertarianism is making something seem as if we're just yelling at each other about competing rights claims, but actually below that may be more of an argument about the good than we're maybe giving credit for.
Thank you very much. Any of our panelists, especially the two called upon by name. You are going to earn your lunch today, panelists.
Looks like it's to me.
I think so.
Yeah, to earn my lunch and say the hard thing. I mean, as Megan knows, I also teach undergraduates and am in these conversations. And as I said, even in the talk, I think those values of equality and stability and the good are important to attend to. But we also have to deal with, for good or for ill, right, a pretty clear Catholic teaching that same-sex acts and therefore same-sex marriage are outside the common good as that is understood in that tradition, right? And I mean, I'm serious when I say we have to deal with that reality. We also have to, I think as a church, deal very seriously with the reality that we do not live in Christendom anymore. And how do we think really well together about what the claims that we can and cannot make about marriage in a pluralistic society. So far, the bishops are leading us down the road that says we still know what marriage is in its natural reality in a way that has an intrinsic connection to procreation, and so excludes this. I mean, you know, again, it's hard, but I think we have to deal with that. But then also to think through how we can have a shared discourse in a pluralistic society in a way that honors all those complicated visions of marriage and the good.
I just want to make one quick complaint. Since I once was a medievalist and have some experience of the richness of the Catholic tradition, I'm disappointed. I mean, I would have expected, and I do expect evangelical Protestants and the whole Protestant tradition, because they've exalted the families as little churches and made such a big deal about families constituting a kind of the core of Christian life. I wouldn't expect any better from them. But the rich analogies that Catholics have used in using language of marriage between bishops and their dioceses, between the individual soul, Jesus, between sisters and Jesus. I mean, I just think there's ample room for movement in a religious community that likes to pride itself on its analogical approach to thinking about things. And so it seems to me that it's a somewhat odd, there's an interesting story there, but about how, I mean, to say nothing about St. Paul and all that, but there's an interesting story about how marriage in this very immediate way becomes so valorized within 20th century Catholicism, and I guess Urs von Balthasar gets some credit for that. But anyway, there are other ways to move, it seems to me, but it's not for me to do.
Mary Jo, do you have any final comments on this?
Well, so I'm just thinking, there are a number of different ways that we can look at the tradition and what it has said about marriage and when that became a sacrament. It's fairly late in the church's history that gets that official stamp of approval. I wonder if we shouldn't go back to where Augustine is saying one of the ends of marriage is to relieve lust. It's a very good thing to relieve the lust that people have and to regulate it, regulate the lust in this relationship. As opposed to, this is the format in which the family, the children, and all those sorts of things need to come into play. If we look more at that marriage is about relieving lust, we can lust after so many different things. I think it ought to be regulated. And the common good would be served insofar as in regulation of lust, let's say, of regulating sexual activity by sanctioned state, church, whatever approval, theoretically then would reduce the incidence of extra-relational relations.
Better to marry than to burn, is what you're saying. Yeah. I think that was St. Paul. Any other questions? I think we've got time for one or two more. Anybody else that, yes, go ahead.
This would be towards Professor Dillon. In my lifetime, we have seen Massachusetts blue laws evaporate so that from a political libertarian point of view, there's no longer the state telling people what they can or can't do on Sunday. And I remember at the time that happened a few decades ago, saying to the rest of my family, it'll be interesting to see what Catholics will do in general to preserve what the Sisters of St. Joseph told me when you were growing up. There's a certain line between servile work and hobbies and what you can do on a Sunday. There seems to me, and I'm asking what your perspective is, because this is something that the Jewish people have preserved more than the Catholics about Sabbath rest, that there's a spiritual libertarianism as far as that goes, and some other aspects of Catholic culture. Actually, a kosher analogy, meat on Fridays, which used to be a year-round thing and now is evaporated. Would you, when you use the term spiritual libertarianism, it seems that it has infected or affected the Catholic Church in several ways: Sabbath rest and dietary laws. And I think this is a cultural spiritual libertarianism that a political libertarian might say, it's a good thing we don't have the blue laws anymore, but why has the church, instead of stepping up and saying this is somehow how we should identify our culture, let it also dissipate?
So it sounded like you were
I was
maybe
talking to Professor Dillon in particular because he had used the word spiritual libertarianism, and also he would have perspective. Sorry.
So I think
my
Professor Silk,
mistake.
is that right?
My mistake.
That's fine.
Professor Silk.
Well, I think the church, I'm sorry. I think it's pretty clear that in Massachusetts, anyway, the church is picking its fights. It did pretty well with the physician last time around with assisted suicide. Blue laws, not not going to fight that. But I don't want to. I really don't want to speak for the bishops. Let these theologians do that, because they have their mandata.
Well, Dana, since you were named, would you like to contribute to this question?
I mean, maybe I'm going to embrace some of my libertarianism here. No, I don't know, but I mean, I don't have a huge desire to see the church lobby the state to make businesses right. But what I hear in your comment that I think we really need to talk more about as a church is, what are the ways that we might embrace a commitment to some spiritual practices, including a sort of Sabbath keeping, resisting consumerism on Sundays, right? Like these sorts of things, and maybe alcoholism or blue laws. Different sorts of things, right? Over consumption of all those things. But that I think that becomes a. This is one of the things where I would shy away from huge cultural change in the secular culture, but actually nurture that in terms of Christian communities. Whatever practices need to be embraced.
Okay, well, one of the basic requirements of the natural law and the corporal works of mercy is that you feed the hungry. So I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our panelists for this session.